Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm In-jung Cho. North Korea conducts live fire drills near the sea border with South Korea for the first time in more than a year. Foreign ministers from nearly 50 countries, including the US, South Korea, and Japan, condemned Russia's use of North Korean missiles against Ukraine. Today, we discuss the rising tensions on the Korean peninsula.
적대행위 중지구역은 더 이상 존재하지 않습니다.
Russian forces have now used DPRK ballistic missiles in Ukraine several times.
For the ROK, this comes as a clear and present demonstration of the existential threat.
In the studio with me, Ms. Mary Beth Long, a distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center. Ms. Long served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and Chairman of NATO's high-level group on nuclear issues. Ms. Long was an operations officer for the Central Intelligence Agency. Also joining us, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Snyder is appointed as the new president of the Korea Economic Institute of America. Previously, Mr. Snyder was the director of U.S.-Korea Policy Center at the Asia Foundation. Mr. Snyder's latest book is the U.S.-South Korea Alliance, Why It May Fail and Why It Must Not. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Snyder, North Korea fired artillery shells near the northern Lebanon line for 3 straight days, and Kim Jong-un and Kim Yo-jong are also making fiery statements against South Korea, calling South Korea main enemy and that North Korea will annihilate South Korea if provoked. What does North Korea try to gain out of raising tensions on the Korean peninsula?
Well, I think the statements themselves provide a kind of readout from the party meetings that show, from the end of the year, that show the direction of North Korean foreign policy for 2024. And I think that you're right that Kim Jong-un and the North Korean leadership clearly view the Yoon administration's emphasis on deterrence and its enhanced cooperation with the United States as hostile. And we've seen a tit-for-tat escalation of tensions in a variety of areas on the peninsula since November. And so I think there are a variety of background factors that are leading to this and that enable it. One is the Russian-North Korea relationship and the changed strategic environment around the peninsula. Another one is the run-up to South Korea's national elections and Kim Jong-un's desire possibly to have an impact or raise North Korea's profile in the context of that election. And then, of course, focusing on the enemy also is an important tool for mobilizing domestic political support and reaffirming the North Korean leadership's legitimacy.
So, Mr. Snyder, you said Kim Jong-un finds the trilateral cooperation among U.S., South Korea, and Japan hostile to him. So is he now trying to drive a wedge in the trilateral cooperation because he is singularly focused on threatening South Korea and then sends a rare condolence message to the Japanese Prime Minister for the deadly earthquake?
Well, I think that North Korea has always sought to try to identify wedges among the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. We see that mostly in the U.S.-South Korea relationship, but I think that even going back to the 1990s, North Korea is usually probing to figure out which party is the most flexible. And in an environment where you have a conservative Yoon administration and a Biden administration that is also focused on deterrence, probing Japan makes sense. I was not surprised to see that there have been some diplomatic contacts, sporadic in 2023 between North Korea and Japan, and now we have this statement. So we'll need to watch and see what happens. Now, honestly, I don't think that it's going to be possible for Kim Jong-un to break the level of coordination that is currently occurring among the US, Japan, and South Korea. But it'll be interesting to see what North Korea tries to do with that.
Ms. Long, North Korea coming so close to the sea border with South Korea, does that show North Korea's confidence that it is ready to make provocations into an actual military confrontations? Do you think there's a very highly likely that there could be some limited clashes between South and North Korea this year, like we saw in 2010 of North Korea attacking the Yeonpyeong Island and the Cheonan Navy ship?
I don't think necessarily, but I do think this is going to be part of a saber rattling of a strategy, propaganda, limited engagement of sorts, like what he did along the border, that we're going to continue to see until at least the Korean elections, probably through the US elections. And he needed to do something to show his prowess in light of the international concerns, of course, of the Russians using North Korean weaponry and missiles in Ukraine and the outcry there. So it wasn't as bad as it could have been, so I don't think it's the first of what is going to be an escalating invasion of South Korea, but I do think we're going to see a lot of it. And the question will be, what does he get out of it? And are there going to be repercussions for his bad behavior, particularly to the extent that it results in loss of life?
The fact that the comprehensive military agreement has been nullified, doesn't that raise the possibility of a high attention of an accidental clash on the Korean Peninsula?
Absolutely, and we always are guarding against accidental clashes or accidental escalations where the military responses to what North Korea does outpaces our policy. But one of the great things about the trilateral is the dialogue, the planning, the contingency planning, and the communication channels are in place to avoid something like that. I don't discount the fact that Kim Jong-un may hope to accidentally trigger something that he can then blame on everyone else. But I do think this is part of a series of pressures he's going to be putting on the island, as well as Japan, the region, and the US.
Mr. Snyder, are you surprised that Kim Jong-un called South Korea main enemy 2 years ago during the Defense Development Exhibition of Defense Self-Defense 2021? Kim Jong-un said neither South Korea nor United States are main enemies, but the war itself is a main enemy. Why the change in the attitude?
Well, we have to remember that in 2021, Kim Jong-un was focused on the Moon administration, and so it was a different environment. And I do believe that with a conservative administration in charge in South Korea, there's a little bit of tit for tat going on. Conservatives usually are more willing to identify North Korea as a main enemy, and I think that Kim Jong-un is also responding to that perception of hostility and the fact that actually the North Korean leadership has never worked well with any conservative leadership in South Korea. There's always been an element of hostility. There's never really been any effort on the part of the North Koreans to reach out in a constructive manner. But, you know, I think that we also have to look at what Kim Yo-jong had to say about Moon Jae-in. You know, that he was a crafty man, but that he was a wicked man with honey in his mouth and a sword in his heart. And I think that tells us something about where North Korea stands in relationship to South Korea, regardless of who is the president. And that is that North Korea regards South Korea itself as an enemy. And I think that actually transcends political divisions within South Korea.
Ms. Long, the State Department calls on North Korea to refrain from provocative and destabilizing actions, and the Defense Department said that it is watching what's going on and will work with South Korea and Japan. Are these messages enough to contain North Korea? What can be done to diffuse the rising tensions?
We were talking before the segment about this cycle of communications and escalations and de-escalations. The answer is no, not even near enough. And I wonder if I were sitting in Pyongyang And I heard the fierce response of our Department of State, whether I would be quaking in my boots, or even dripping my coffee. And the answer is no. I don't think it gets their attention. I think it's one of the basic problems of U.S. policy vis-a-vis North Korea right now. We don't have their attention, and strongly worded, please don't do that again, I think are actually counterproductive at this point. I can only hope, and I believe, that with the trilateral, with the very consistent Department of Defense, with the ongoing talks about how not only to enhance contingency planning, to look at our missile defense, our enhancing our maritime and space and other defensive and longer term capabilities with South Korea, that will be the response. That's the real response. Number one. But there does need to be, and I hope in the next weeks we will see some kind of consequences, so we can at least, if not contain or prevent these escalatory, someone called them a tantrum the other day by Kim Jong-un. I don't think we can stop them. I think we do have to do more than just talk. To make sure he understands the guardrails.
So what could be those consequences? North Korea fired artillery shells, South Korea fired back. There's more sanctions on North Korea, but what could be other substantial consequences to impose penalty on North Korea?
Well, I think, frankly, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but I think we probably know a little bit more about the state of North Korean interballistic missiles, maybe a little bit more about the supply chain. We certainly know a lot more about, in the last year, about its use of Bitcoin and transferring its sources of wealth. So concrete actions by the United States, by the international community, not returning to the dog-eared sanctions normal list, maybe even opening up some new channels of cooperation militarily, both offensively and defensively with the South Koreans, and being clear that these are firmly on the table should he continue upon this path of these probing escalatory provocations.
So I think the U.S. government is actually getting itself into a little bit of a difficulty right at this moment, because it's very clear that the Biden administration is seized with whatever North Korea is providing to Russia to use against Ukraine. And it has issued a very rapid response, including sanctions, in response to North Korea's use of, or Russia's use of North Korean short-range ballistic missiles. But it really hasn't said that much about the inter-Korean tensions. And so that's a concern, because it shows that the administration is more focused on what is happening with Ukraine than what may happen on the peninsula. So that probably needs to be rectified as maybe a first step toward recognizing that tensions are slowly increasing on the peninsula and the risk of conflict has increased.
So you're saying the U.S. government is not paying so much attention to the Korean Peninsula issue itself, but only related to the Ukrainian issue. What's interesting is State Department called North Korea to return to dialogue, whereas the new South Korean Foreign Minister Cho Tae-yeol said that it is not the time for dialogue when North Korea continues to advance nuclear and missile developments, and South Korea is not even in the mood to have dialogue with North Korea. Where does this discrepancy come from? And is the United States just trying to manage the situation for now?
Well, I do believe that there is a sense in which the Biden administration has so many things on its plate that it really doesn't want tensions on the peninsula to bubble up. But at the same time, we see that tensions are bubbling up. And I think that if there is some kind of conflict, then that will very quickly fix the Biden administration's attention, and it will have no choice but to respond in some fashion. But as a general matter of deterrence, I just want to reinforce what Mary Beth is saying. At this point, the North Koreans are, I think, cognizant of the fact that most of what the U.S. is saying is words, and it has not yet been backed up by actions.
We could go on. I think the verbiage coming out of South Korea leadership, the Minister of Defense in particular, was really good this week. And this disconnect between the leadership in South Korea saying, no, we're beyond words at this point. Returning to dialogue is not going to satisfy this. And the State Department coming up almost at the same time saying, let's return to dialogue. That's really an unforced error on the part of our administration. And there's a lot of talk about Gaza and the U.S. being overcommitted and stretched. No, we're a big nation. And I think one of the things our allies have a right to expect is that before you make an announcement like that, you coordinate. So you don't have an ally calling for dialogue, saying dialogue's not enough, within a news cycle of you saying, let's our only response to this, really serious, not just for South Korea, but the region, and Indonesia, Vietnam, they're all watching this, and it's rare to see a real diplomatic disconnect like that in public. And it's unfortunate, and it needs to be fixed.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now I want to move on to the Russian-North Korean military cooperation and Russia using the North Korean short-range ballistic missiles to attack Ukraine. The White House said that Russia used those missiles on December 30th, January 2nd, and January 6th. South Korea said that Russia using these North Korean missiles in Ukraine is an existential threat to South Korea because now North Korea is using Ukraine as a testing ground for its nuclear-topped missiles. What sort of military and technical knowledge can North Korea gain by all these developments, Ms. Long?
I think the point the South Koreans are making, and I think your Minister of Defense made it, is basic missileology. You can build a missile, you can test fly a missile, but the information on its performance and how it actually works in combat is critical. And it's something that the U.S. feels is very valuable. And North Korea, of course, is gaining information, as are the Russians, about how their missile is actually performing under weather condition, under possible jamming conditions, under conditions where it is meeting, presumably, missile defense activities or mechanisms. So how does it actually perform? Is it communicating internally correctly? On the flip side of that, though, every analyst I spoke to this week was delighted and somewhat surprised that Kim Jong-un, who does a pretty good job at keeping his developments in his missile program tightly held, would risk the plethora of not only what kind of propellant it uses, how it performs, how it communicates with itself, the payload, how it deals with its payload. Does it actually fly the way it was intended? How it was constructed? If one of them are shot down and available, you can bet there are already people tearing apart the supply chain issues, manufacturing issues, all of that. It's really a double-edged sword. But yes, South Korean leadership should be concerned because it is a very important way. It's a critical way for any defensive Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine to test something in combat. And the Russians, of course, and the North Koreans will take advantage of this opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to the issue of testing in combat, the fact that the scope of the North Korea-Russia military relationship is expanding, it means that North Korea can expect more from Russia in return in the areas that it is interested in. Mm-hmm. And that actually accelerates North Korea's military development. And so I would argue that regardless of, or in addition to, the knowledge that is gained through actual use of these missiles in the Ukrainian theater, the real concern should be that the scope of the Russian quid pro quo in terms of provision to North Korea is also expanding possibly to new areas that we previously had fairly high confidence the Russians were not going to supply North Korea in.
Which include nuclear submarines, which include nuclear technology, which include ICBM technology. All those things could be now given to North Korea, both of you think?
Next generation air capabilities. There's a whole range. I mean, the Kim-Putin summit demonstrated the laundry list in terms of where Kim Jong-un visited. And it's a pretty extensive laundry list. And we don't necessarily know with certainty what the specific items are going to be, but we can say that the scope is expanding.
I so agree, and I actually think that's the more important consideration. And it's, if I may, it's not just items, it's know-how, it could be technology. And I've noted a lack of imagination of how far and how deep this could go. The deepening, broadening defense relationship between Korea and Russia is really worrisome.
Mr. Snyder, foreign ministers from 49 countries issued a joint statement condemning Russia for using North Korean missiles against Ukraine. The next day, 8 countries, mostly UN Security Council members, also issued a similar joint statement. How is naming and shaming effective in this situation?
Well, it's inevitable that we're going to do it, but I think that it's particularly ineffective with North Korea and Russia. We saw the same thing around the Kim-Putin summit because it's hard to do naming and shaming if you're dealing with leaders that have no shame. And so it basically means that that's not going to be effective. It's going to have to be accompanied by some additional actions. We've seen a very rapid reaction, I think, generally speaking, comparatively. In terms of implementation of sanctions on the Russian air wings that were involved with transferring the North Korean missiles to the western part of Russia. But we're also reaching an interesting point where it may well be that only a set of actions is going to be sufficient to fix the attention of both parties on the unacceptability of the engagement. And it's a real challenge because the options are limited, but I think that there probably are options, not all of which would necessarily be public.
So those set of options, Ms. Long, Ukrainian Security Service, SBU, is targeting Russian railways deep in Siberia that are delivering military munitions to Russia. Should the Russian railways that transport North Korean and Russian military cooperation, should that also be targeted by the international community?
Yes and no. As a general principle, I agree with Scott, and he's so much more measured in saying so. But I think we're often at a time when action must be done. And I do think what you're proposing, the underlying premise of are we willing to put everything on the table as far as whether it's the Russian railways and how Russia's receiving. I also think if we could identify the quid pro quo, the back end of that, all aspects of that cooperation should be on the table. I also think there have been long-held areas that we have not taken action against the international community or the United States of how North Korea supplies itself of critical energy, of financial. I think all of those need to be on the table. It may be unrealistic given the complications of Ukraine and Russia, certainly to depend on the Ukrainians to go after the Russian railway systems. And I wouldn't know, and I wouldn't even presume to talk tactically about where those trains were, what systems they were, whether frankly they were also vital to Ukraine and other efforts. But I think all of those in principle should be on the table, and then there has to be consequences, and it has to be beyond dialogue. It has to be action. It has to show a hurt. It has to be painful for both Russia and for North Korea to continue this kind of cooperation.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Ms. Long, Mr. Snyder, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.